Thank you all so much for being here. So this is Copper and Heat Podcast. I'll tell you a little bit more about us, who's sitting on the stage, etc. in a second. But I wanted to start this off with a little bit of a social experiment. So raise your hand if in the last month you have had food from a restaurant, food truck, takeout, dine-in, whatever. Just raise your hand. Literally everybody. All right, cool. Perfect. Now, raise your hand if you've ever worked in restaurants, bars, service industry. All right, cool, like half, more than half it looks like. Sweet. So, about us, Copper and Heat. We like to go behind the scenes of restaurants and talk about what it's really like to work in the industry, because I cannot tell you the amount of times that I have heard people think that chef's table or Chopped is what it's like. And for those of you that have worked in the industry, not the case. So, before we go too much further, my name is Katy. I'm the creator and host of Copper and Heat. This is Ricardo. We started this together, and he's the sound and music guy. So we have two other members of the team that couldn't be here today, but this is Rachel. She's our editor and producer, and Bella, our podcat. In addition to being a podcaster, I'm also a cook, like I do it professionally. I've worked in all sorts of restaurants, but the majority of my career was in the San Francisco Bay Area, working in fine dining restaurants with Michelin stars. But Boise is where it all started for me. I went to school at C of I, woohoo yotes, studied anthropology and journalism, and became fascinated with the culture around what and why we eat. So that's me hanging out with some baby goats and making cheese out in Parma at Rolling Stone Chev. They're not around anymore, but best cheese ever. But that's what led me to kitchens, and then years later to create this podcast. So for this live show, we're going back to our first season, which was entitled Be a Girl, and going through the journey of what I've learned through the production of this show, and specifically what I've learned about the challenges that women of all identities face in the restaurant industry. Just a heads up, since we are talking about the restaurant industry, and we're talking about women in the restaurant industry, I'm going to be cursing a little bit. There's also going to be talk of sexual harassment, so content warning here. This presentation might also be a little bit different than some of the others that were up on this stage. We're doing a live recording of one of our episodes. So how it's going to work, Ricardo here has some interviews queued up as well as music. And I'm going to be doing my usual voiceover recording, which I'm usually doing in a blanket with my cat by myself. So I actually get to look at your lovely faces, which is excellent. All right, here we go. The first time I felt like I was singled out as a woman was a whole 10 minutes into the interview for my first kitchen job. This was about 10 years ago, and I was here in Boise. The restaurant's not around anymore, but it definitely defined a lot for me as far as setting the tone for what I thought working in kitchens would and should be like. When I was interviewed for the cook position, one of the last things the chef said to me was, "You're gonna be the only girl. You have to have tough skin." In my head, being who I am, I took that as a challenge. I'm not like other girls.
Menu number 2, please. To be produced now. 6 feet. Where's please? Correct, 3. Menu number 2, please.
This is Copper and Heat, the podcast exploring the unspoken rules and traditions of restaurants. I'm Katy Osuna. Women make up over half of all food service workers, 40% of cooks, 22% of chefs and head cooks like kitchen managers, sous chefs, etc., but only 7% of head chefs across the US. Now, I didn't really know that when I decided I wanted to cook. I knew I just wanted to cook. So I threw myself into learning everything I could about kitchens and the culinary arts. It was that same time that I started reading Anthony Bourdain's Kitchen Confidential. If you've read it, you know how it describes the pirate-like environment of a kitchen, the hardcore people dealing with the heat and the burns and the stress through drugs, alcohol, sex, and toxic masculinity. which came to be what kitchens were known and loved for. The fact that the people that worked in them were outside of what normal and polite society was like was what drew a lot of people to kitchens, particularly young men.
Then I saw the line, and when you see that adrenaline and that pace and the teamwork that goes into it, it's addicting.
Yeah, it's definitely like a club. I can relate with someone who cooks much quicker than I can relate with someone who doesn't.
You do feel like part of a unit, a family of sorts, because you all are in the same boat. Everybody else just went through the same thing you did, and you feel like nobody else can understand what you guys just went through, and very few other people can.
Chefs have this reputation of being like pirates. You can be tattooed and kind of fucked up, but if you can cook, you can work in the kitchen.
The pirate-like environment was also what drew me to it. I wanted to be a badass girl. I thought in order for me to fit into a kitchen and to do my job, I had to fit in with the guys, and that's what I liked about it. I remember there was this one time we were all standing on the line messing around before a busy service. There were some raw bratwurst sausages for a sandwich that was on the menu. One of the cooks took a sausage, put it under his apron, and went up to another cook and was like, "Yo, dude," and made him look at the bratwurst he was holding where his dick would be. At the time, I was laughing. It was pretty funny. But it wasn't until later that I would analyze what about it made me uncomfortable, and what about it didn't make me uncomfortable at the time, but was inherently misogynistic and homophobic. This is a pretty tame joke as far as kitchens go. And the culture of kitchens is built in this way that hurts people that don't fit into a certain kind of box.
Yeah, you're not like other girls. Yeah, I've gotten that a lot.
This is Edelyn. I worked with her at a Michelin-starred restaurant in California. She's worked her way up in kitchens to be a chef de cuisine, or one of the people that runs the show, basically, in a kitchen. And she's at a Michelin-starred place in the Bay Area. She was a junior sous chef and my boss when I first started out in the Bay Area, and I really looked up to her, even though we're basically the same age, because she just kicked ass. I worked with her on the savory side of the kitchen, and she was basically the only one that was a woman, besides me, as compared to pastry, which was primarily women. So I was pretty stoked. It wasn't until years later, when we sat down to have this conversation, that I realized that she also went through a lot of the same thought processes that I did.
I think I've noticed for early on that, quote unquote, I'm not like other girls, whatever the hell that means. Do I feel like I've had to make myself more masculine in the kitchen? In a sense, yes. But I feel like I've always just been a tomboy and not as sensitive as other girls. They'd always think that I was tough. But honestly, I feel like I've had to make myself that way working in the kitchen. Kind of just roll with the punches or even take the punches, whatever the case may be.
When I was first starting out, I was like, hell yeah, I'm so cool because I'm the kind of girl who can hang with the guys. I was putting myself above the girly girls who I thought just couldn't hang in the kitchen, which is an incredibly narrow idea of what feminism is. And as the years went by, I worked in more kitchens, usually as one of the only, if not the only woman, and started feeling more uncomfortable about that view that I held on to. And the more I started to work through that and become more comfortable with myself as a woman, the more uncomfortable I felt in kitchens. So this is where I was as we were producing our first season, processing my experiences and talking to some of my friends and coworkers like Edelyn. But as I spent time hearing a lot of the different anecdotes and experiences, it left me with a lot more of the why questions. And I was not the only one.
Well, after the first interview that we had, I thought to myself, I never really thought about what it is to be a girl in the kitchen. Why aren't there as many female chefs as there are males? I was just too busy trying to do, my best and trying to make a name for myself that it never really crossed my mind. And it got my wheels turning a little bit. I'm like, what, why? I had never thought about it.
As we wrapped up the first season, I did some follow-up interviews with a couple of my friends after they'd had a few months to kind of think about and process what we were chatting about. And Edelyn was one of those, and she had thought about it a lot.
But the more I think about it, the more I feel like I have a responsibility to, you know, be a good role model for future female chefs out there. I don't only want to help empower my female chefs, but I want to empower the ones who are of color. There are not many chefs out there that are of color. In America, when you're of color, you do have it harder than others. And that's just the story of the game. We can argue, you know, back and forth that that's not the case, but we all know that's what the case is. Like, it's just something that you didn't choose to be white. I didn't choose to be brown. We didn't choose to be girls. But I think the more that we acknowledge that we do have it, like people of color have it harder than, I mean, a white person, the more that we won't be discouraged to you know, go out and reach our goals, make our dreams our reality.
This conversation with Edelyn broke open the floodgates for me. Talking to different cooks and chefs about their experiences with sexism was one thing, but the whys it brought up were a whole other beast. So as we wrapped up the season, it left a lot of the systemic issues of the restaurant industry unaddressed, and especially how those systemic issues affected people that weren't cis white women like me. That's when I started reading a lot more from other people and their experiences, which led me to Prithee Mystery, who is a chef in Oakland. As a queer Indian American non-binary person, they've experienced a lot of these systemic issues firsthand. In their whole career, they've been incredibly outspoken about trying to make the industry better. So much so that they are constantly quoted in articles and on TV shows, and have started their own podcast, which, full transparency, we produce. But this outspokenness has gotten them into a fair amount of hot water over the years. Before the Me Too movement hit the restaurant industry in the summer of 2017, Prithee had a canary in the coal mine experience, they like to call it. Early 2017, Prithee was approached by a journalist to be in an article about Thomas Keller. Thomas Keller is considered to be one of the fathers of fine dining, modern fine dining, with his 3 Michelin-star French Laundry in California and several other restaurants. He's all over the place. So this article was full of other chefs talking about how great and important Thomas Keller is. Prithee took a slightly different approach.
I told her how much I was enamored with fine dining, that I went to the fucking French Laundry almost 20 years ago. I remember shaking Thomas Keller's hand and felt like I was meeting the superstar. But that, you know, where I stood at that moment, which was running 2 small independent restaurants in Oakland, I'd experienced a lot of sexism, racism, homophobia, and I had a lot of criticisms about the fine dining sort of industrial complex.
What Prithee said was actually that Thomas Keller and other fine dining chefs needed to go on their woke journey because the industry is steeped in oppression. To which Thomas Keller responded, "Been there, done that, I don't really see a need."
And it was met with, like, fire and fury. Somehow it turned into, like, I'm saying that fine dining white guy chefs are all racist, and, like, that's not what I said.
Prithee got all sorts of DMs and comments from people that they didn't even know, calling them shameful, saying, "What do you even know about it?" etc. Another chef from a Michelin-starred fine dining place in Napa Valley in California took to Instagram and posted this. The general gist being, "Hey, I have people of color and women in my kitchen. There are no systemic issues in the industry." So Prithee got a lot of shit for this. And then Me Too hit the restaurant industry. As it turns out, there's actually a lot of shitty stuff that happens in the restaurant industry. And then COVID happens, and the same older white male chefs that were calling Prithee shameful years before were suddenly praised for their criticisms of the systemic issues in the restaurant industry.
And, you know, these are all spokes of the same wheel. Like, I might be talking about, you know, systemic racism and sexism. All those things are tied to the same wheel that makes men feel like they can treat women in a workplace in these ways.
Y'all are sitting here at a food for presentation, or you're still sitting here at least, so you probably have some interest in restaurants and food. So you might have heard about this labor shortage that it has been caused by COVID and rising restaurant wages. If you haven't, here's a little graph about the numbers of restaurant workers and change of wages in the last 10 years. The restaurant industry has had a labor shortage for a while, actually. Turns out, less people want to work really hard for really terrible wages. It's a little bit more complicated than that. But the long and short of it is that working in restaurants is really hard. And a lot of people have to work 2 or 3 jobs to make it work financially. I bring this up because the financial models that the restaurant industry has operated under for decades place a really large burden on people of color and women. And this is what Prithee was getting at 5 years ago. I came out of season 1 feeling incredibly overwhelmed. If that's where you're at right now, welcome. There are some really big and complex issues that we're talking about. And when I get really overwhelmed, I tend to do a bunch of research, and I go down and down a spiral and just keep researching on the internet. Not necessarily great all the time, but something that I kept coming up against as I was researching and trying to understand why the restaurant industry is the way it is was money. The economic systems that the restaurant industry is built on, not so great. So that's what we ended up doing for season 2 of Copper and Heat. We dove into several specific financial challenges like immigrant labor, the value of a meal, sick time, or lack thereof, and tipping. I think breaking it down a little bit will help explain a lot about why the restaurant industry is the way it is. So we're going to start by going back to the US in the 1800s.
The notion of tipping came to the States in the 1850s when rich Americans started traveling to Europe and coming back and trying to show off that they knew the rules of Europe.
This is Saru Jayaraman. She runs an organization called One Fair Wage. They're all about getting rid of tipped wages. And they do a whole lot of research about how that affects folks living off of tips. So tipping was initially rejected here in the States because it was a vestige of feudal society in Europe. And as Americans, we're like, no, we are a democracy. We don't want to do that. And we thought that the employers should be paying their workers, not the customers. That was picked up by the labor movement in Europe. And now they basically don't do it over there. And if they do, it's just a little bit on top of a wage. But over here,
the timing didn't work out so well. The arrival of tipping and that anti-tipping movement coincided with emancipation of slavery. And at emancipation, the restaurant lobby and one other industry, the Pullman Train Company, male porters on trains and then mostly black women servers in restaurants. At emancipation, these two lobbies wanted to hire these two groups of black people and pay them nothing and have them live entirely on tips.
So, fast forward, it's 2022, and the federal minimum wage for tipped workers is $2.13. Yes, $2.13. And though the tipped minimum wage was going up with the federal minimum wage for a while, it's been frozen at $2.13 for about 40 years. There are 7 states who have actually gotten rid of a sub-minimum wage for tipped workers. Notice how Idaho's a little bit surrounded over there. But the vast majority of the country still has the sub-minimum wage. And most of the people who are living off of tips are women.
What we learned through first hearing from workers and then doing lots of research with those workers is that when you are paid a $2 or $3 or $4 wage, your wage is so low it goes entirely to taxes. You're living completely off your tips. You have to put up with whatever the customer does to you, however they touch you or treat you or talk to you, because the customer is always right. The customer pays your bills, not your employer. And on top of that, the research showed that managers are telling most women in the industry, dress more sexy, show more cleavage, wear tighter clothing in order to make more money in tips. And that affects kitchens and kitchen workers as well. A woman chef, pastry chef, her executive chef, who is a white man, he was married, but he regularly dated the servers, and he would essentially give them better or worse shifts based on their willingness to go out with him, date him, have sex with him. And so since he saw all the women in the front as his playthings, he saw her, who was only one of the few women in the kitchen, as his plaything as well. And he would regularly touch her, grab her, harass her. She was paid far less than the male pastry chef. And this woman said, I know it's because he sees these servers in the front and he thinks he can do whatever he wants with them, that he does the same to me.
So basically, when we say sexism is a systemic issue in the restaurant industry, we mean it's codified in laws like tipping, whether it was intentional or not, though I would argue it was very intentional. There are a lot of things happening to try and change this, including One Fair Wage working with states to get rid of the sub-minimum wage. Some restaurants are experimenting with getting rid of tips altogether and raising prices or adding a service charge, but it is very complicated. Even though we explored a lot of these economic and financial challenges in the restaurant industry in season 2, the other part about producing our second season was trying to find examples of people who were actively overcoming these barriers and trying to find creative ways to deal with them. It just so happens that my absolute favorite food in the world is mac and cheese, and one of my favorite places to eat in the Bay Area before we even moved there was a mac and cheese restaurant called Homeroom. And it just so happens that Homeroom has been doing some really interesting things with their business model to try and address some of the systemic issues in the industry, which just made me love them even more.
We have like 5 core values and we take them really seriously.
This is Erin Wade. She's the founder and owner of Homeroom.
Our first is two-way transparency. We're an open book company, so we share our finances with our staff and we teach financial literacy. The second is to revolutionize business, and specifically by doing our part to topple the patriarchy. 95% of our leadership team are women and people of color, and we feel like that's important.
She mentions in this clip that their leadership is 95% women and people of color. But once you add in folks that identify as LGBTQ+, that reaches the 100% that leadership mentions on this slide. Pretty sweet.
The third is be inclusive.
A big part of that is not just having a diverse staff, which they do, but also having diverse leadership, like we already talked about, and also promoting from within.
The fourth value is to have best-in-class product and service. So, honestly, all these values are lovely, but if we're not serving the best mac and cheese you've ever eaten in your life, I don't want to say who cares, but that has to happen.
I mean, they do. Look at it.
And the last one is to be engaged in collective success. So we filter all of our decisions in the entire company through what is best for not just the individual, but for the team, for our customers, and for the company.
A big part of putting these core values into action is what they call passing notes. They have this whole school theme going on. So this is a weekly thing that everyone on staff has to do, and it's their way of gathering feedback. So there are 3 questions, everybody on staff has to answer them, and then leadership reads all of that feedback.
And the truth is, those suggestions, that's really what creates a culture of continuous improvement, because you have 100 great minds working on all your problems every day, as opposed to the 5 people that sit in the office.
And one of the biggest improvements to come out of this?
We have a sexual harassment prevention system that we've had in place for 4 years that our staff developed in response to customer-based harassment.
So this interview was a few years ago. So they've had it for more than 4 years at this point. But the system is this color code for servers to report to managers. So yellow for a creepy vibe from a customer, orange is for a comment with sexual undertones, and red is for overt sexual comments, touching, or repeated orange-level behavior. So each color has an action associated with it. The red, the person just gets immediately kicked out by a manager. Orange means that a shift manager will take over the table so that the server doesn't have to interact with that person anymore. And then yellow means a manager must take over the table if the staff member wants them to. It's been wildly successful, so much so that the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission has adopted it, and Erin's helped other restaurants incorporate it as well.
That is an example of what can happen when you actually adopt all of the values that I talked about, the two-way transparency, collective success, and trying to revolutionize business, right?
So that's just one example of how rethinking the systemic issues in the restaurant industry can lead to some pretty sweet improvements. One of my other favorite programs is called La Cocina. It's also in the Bay Area. La Cocina is a business incubator designed to help women, and specifically women of color, start food businesses and restaurants. They've incubated around 60 businesses, and they have 30 brick and mortar locations throughout the San Francisco Bay Area, including their new food hall in San Francisco. They're really a testament to how, even in one of the most expensive and toughest restaurant markets, if you help level the playing field, women-run and owned businesses can thrive.
And one thing I always say with La Cocina, I didn't realize how important my story was. My mom called me her little princess from the hood. Like, who wants to know about me, you know? So I didn't realize it until La Cocina, that not only is my food important, but my story is too.
So this is Fernay McPherson. She owns Mini Bells in Oakland. Fernay was born and raised in the Fillmore district of San Francisco, as was her father before her. The Fillmore was a primarily black neighborhood until a series of urban renewal campaigns displaced a ton of people, tore down the Victorian homes and their businesses, and built a bunch of low-income housing. If you haven't heard, housing in the Bay Area? Astronomical. So these Victorian homes are worth millions of dollars now. Combine that with the lost businesses, and urban renewal basically wiped out the wealth of the black community there. But Fernay and her family still live in the neighborhood, and she has made it her mission to open a restaurant there to celebrate the black businesses that were there before her. But it's been incredibly challenging as a black woman to get enough money to do it.
I just don't have access to that type of money, or investors for that matter. Even some of the women who have these names are still fighting to get these restaurant groups. You know, they're still fighting. And these are people that's been in the industry long before me. It's tough. It's just really tough. But one thing I do feel like is that there are more opportunities coming now than when I first came into the industry. And women are being recognized. When we went to the Beard House, that was the theme of our, we honored the matriarchs in our family, which are all women, More recognition is coming to us as women, but we're also fighting to have that and knock those walls down, I'll get there.
So here we are now, 4 years after we dropped our first episode, all of us having eaten in a restaurant, most of us having worked in a restaurant, which is pretty sweet. And some things have changed, but honestly, not all that much. It's impossible to talk about the state of the restaurant industry and not mention COVID. It really cracked open a lot of these systemic issues that we've been suppressing for decades and brought them to the forefront. Combine that with the reckoning around racial justice, and the restaurant and food media industries are having a really rough time figuring out what the hell to do next. So we started this podcast 4 years ago, thinking it was just going to be a one-off project, a way for me to blow off steam while I was working in restaurants. It's turned into a lot more than that. Each season, we dig deeper into all these issues and come out with way more questions than we went in with, which is really overwhelming, but also a big part of what motivates me. We keep finding all these really awesome people who are doing the most interesting things, like Fernay, building her business from the ground up despite all these systemic issues, and Erin taking down the patriarchy through open book management. We're never going to find one solution to solve all the racism and sexism and other systemic issues in the industry. I know this. But we do find people every day who are asking the right questions and challenging the systems in their own ways. And hopefully, more women, femmes, and people that aren't straight white guys take control of kitchens, because only a man would have a Michelin-starred restaurant and think it's okay to make your guests lick foam from a cast of your mouth. Thanks for listening. on that note. So you can check us out. We're at Copper and Heat on social media. These are all the people that I mentioned in the episode. But we have, how long do we have? Like 15 minutes ish. So we like having conversations. I'd love to hear questions, thoughts, comments. Oh, Harrison, of course, quick on the draw. I'll repeat the question for the recording. Thank you for the reminder. So Harrison just asked about Homeroom and how they're doing things in the front of house to help combat sexual harassment, but what are they doing in the back of house? So Aaron and I didn't talk about that directly, but I think that when you kind of create that culture in the restaurant in general, that it helps. I know that they have like a one strike you're out policy when it comes to sexual harassment, so I think that's a big deal as well. But I don't know if they have any specific like programs like this one that they talked about. But I think also with open book management and the feedback kind of process that they have, from what it sounds like, they get a pretty big amount of participation from the rest of the staff in that. And so they're able to kind of deal with those things a little bit more head on than some of the restaurants that just kind of like to ignore things and sweep them under the rug. So that's the best I can answer that question, but hopefully that does a little bit. Who's next? Sorry, thank you. Repeat the question. The question was, what is One Fair Wage doing in order to get rid of tipping? Are they like increasing the price on dishes, et cetera? So they're doing a lot of different things. Their primary goal is getting states to pass various policy to just get rid of the sub-minimum wage. So like I said, 213 is the federal minimum wage for tipped workers. Employers are supposed to make that up if they don't reach the actual minimum wage, which there's like an 80%, whatever, like people don't actually follow it. There's 80% of people that just don't actually follow that. There was a big Department of Labor study that was done on that a few years ago. So One Fair Wage is just trying to get rid of that altogether. So like those 7 states that I mentioned up there, I think DC and New York are their top priorities right now. That's where they have folks that are actually organizing and doing that kind of stuff. They're really trying to get into other states. When I interviewed her, I mentioned that I was from Idaho, and she's like, I've never talked to anybody from Idaho. And I'm like, I will try to get somebody to talk to you. So that's what One Fair Wage is focusing on specifically, but One Fair Wage also has several other like sister organizations. One of them is called RAISE, RAISE, and they are all about training operators on how to do various DEIA, diversity, equity, inclusion, access programs in their restaurants. So their big thing is like profit sharing, open book management, and getting rid of tipping and finding different ways to do that. But when we talk about like individual restaurants trying to make change, like getting rid of tips and putting on a service charge or just raising prices, when they do that piecemeal, it's really hard for the restaurant, right? Because like people are going to look at the menu and be like, oh, that burger is $3 more than the other restaurant. I'm not going to go there. So unless there's actually like a systemic change, it's just a lot harder. So that's why One Fair Wage kind of focuses on the legislative action, and then RAISE focuses more on teaching and educating operators. So if anybody knows anybody here in Idaho that wants to talk to them, let me know. Yeah, so the question was, do we think that sub-minimum wage is going to be gone in our lifetime? I see, so Carlo, restaurant owner from Portland, is behind you shaking his head. I don't think it'll be completely gone in our lifetimes. I think there are some interesting strides, interesting things people are doing. I mean, Oregon is one of the states that doesn't have the sub-minimum wage, but tipping is still really hard. It's still really hard to get like front of house on board. It's really hard to get all the restaurant owners in the state on board, like even if it is illegal. So it's complicated. And until we have like federal action on this, like I don't know that that's gonna happen. But optimistically, I think some really cool things are happening. So yes. else? Go ahead, please. And you mentioned that you're actually not the first person. So I have another friend down in Santa Cruz who is trying to open a restaurant, and she was just asking me, we did this as a practice for her, and she was like, wait, tell me more about this. Like, wouldn't people be mad because they see how much money is coming in and they want more? We did a 2-part episode in our second season all about open book management. There is a restaurant in Boston called May. It is owned by Irene Lee, who actually is winning a James Beard Award this year for her work, a leadership award. And the thing about open book management is that you obviously have to train your staff on how to understand the finances of a business, right? They see that the business is making $1 million a year, and they're like, sweet, you must be making a shitload of money. Which is not the case usually for small businesses. So right before the pandemic, March 8th of 2020, Irene actually opened her books to the public. So she did a big event in Boston. There were like 200 people there. And she walked everybody through kind of what they do with the staff. And she talked through like, okay, so like 30%, well, for them it was a little higher, but like, in a healthy restaurant, 30% is going to cost of goods sold, like the ingredients. 30% is going to labor. 30% is going to overheads. And if you're healthy, you have 10% of profit. Yeah. May was operating with a 2% margin, so very low, and she was paying herself like not very much. So the great thing about open book management is that the entire staff understands, okay, this is where all that money is going. A lot of that profit is going to debt, like repaying debt, right? They also understood like, okay, this is how much Irene is paying herself. Also, she deserves to like pay herself at least. And then the entire team can be on board with like figuring out different efficiencies, right? It is complicated because you do have to train them to understand like a whole P&L, which is profit and loss statement, which is incredibly complicated for somebody who doesn't know what they're looking at. So I haven't heard any like pushback. I think mostly people are into it. But I would be interested to hear if there was anybody who was like, this sucks. Yeah. But yeah. Yeah. Yes. Oh, I'll back first.
Are there any restaurants in Idaho that you know of that are implementing initiatives like this so that we can be?
Oh, I'm gonna. Anybody in Boise know? Thank you, Becky.
Broadcast Coffee has no tips.
Broadcast Coffee, is that what you said?
Broadcast Coffee,
Petit Four.
There's a couple places up in Moscow.
Couple places up in Moscow. The question was, are there any places in Idaho that we can go to support this? As I don't off the top of my head. I should have probably.
I think the wine bar with Uncorked by Boise Co-op too is on too.
Which one?
Uncorked, the wine bar.
Uncorked, the wine bar.
By Boise Co-op.
Cool. Anybody else know? Alex, do you know any?
Hold on. Well, Michelin in Moscow is I think the one stuff they're talking about.
Okay. Oh, yeah. I don't know of any off the top of my head, and now I'm like, oh, shit.
Sorry.
No, don't be. New research topic. Who's doing that in Idaho? Yeah, Alex. Where am I excited to eat in Boise? We went to Kin last night and had ramen. I love Kin. With Carlo. And Tots, obviously. Where did we go last time we were here that we were like, oh, damn, that's actually really good? Certified. We always go to Certified or Wilder. I love Certified's sourdough. And I mean, any of the Basque restaurants. But Ansat's was the most exciting because they opened since I was gone. That covers them. Ailfort tent. Which I think Kin is doing some of the food there, so that makes sense. Yeah. Those are the big highlights. So the question was, the James Beard semifinalists from Boise were an incredibly diverse group of people. Is that something that they're focusing on nationally, or is that just what is happening in Boise? But yes, that is definitely something that they have been pushing for in the last year. So 2019 was the last, right? 2019 was the last year that they did it. And then they skipped doing James Beard Awards because they were like, there's a lot of shit going on that we have to address, because as an awards, like there was a lot of equity issues. So they went through this whole process, internal process. There's like a 50-page report on it or something of like, oh, here are all our findings about how we go about selecting our semifinalists and nominees. Shout out to Carlo, who's also a nominee. Yeah. So how it works, semifinalists is a bigger group. It drops down to 3 nominees, and then they choose a winner at the awards in June. So I think everybody from Boise, which I was really bummed about, dropped off in the semifinalist round. But I'm hoping that one year they will keep going. But yeah, it was an incredibly diverse group. And that is definitely, as you look through the list of everybody nationally, that was what they were focusing on this year. Especially considering everything that happened the last couple of years. Yes. Did you have another one? Oh, question. So it was Me Too movement, the color-coded system at Homeroom. Are there any other things being implemented, cool programs and systems? Programs like that I have not heard of. I'm trying to think. I know that I mentioned Raise already. I know that that's a big part of what they do as well, is like educating on how to put different programs into place. And I think it's mostly reporting through like not having somebody on HR that reports directly to, like, is part of the leadership team, but somebody that's like a third party that people can report to. So that's, I think, like the biggest thing that I've heard about. So that it's not, they don't have some qualm about like, oh, I can't go tell leadership, because then it's just going to get gossipy, because the restaurant industry is very gossipy. So that's the only other kind of program improvements that I've heard of, but that's another thing that I should look into. I'm trying to think. Can you think of any other ones? No. Yeah. I think that's time. So thank you all so much for coming.